Picture this. You have been wet for 6 days. Not the kind of wet where you stepped in a puddle on the way to a building with central heating and dry clothes waiting inside. The kind of wet where the distinction between your skin and the air around it has become largely theoretical. Your clothing, animal hides that took days of skilled labor to produce, are waterlogged and heavy and beginning to do the opposite of what clothing is supposed to do, which is to say they are now actively cold against your skin rather than warm. And the smell they are producing is not improving anyone's mood in the camp. Your fire, which you have been fighting to maintain for the better part of 3 days, is a smoking, hissing argument between wet wood and the determination of the person assigned to tend it, and the argument is not consistently going in the right direction. The last significant meal the group had was 4 days ago. The food stores are not empty, but they are getting there, and everyone in camp is performing the specific mental calculation of people who are monitoring a resource that is declining, not panicking, not yet, but aware. The children have stopped complaining about the rain, which is either a sign that they have adapted or a sign that the adaptation has moved into the specific quiet that adults in the group recognize as a different kind of concern. And here is the situation. Someone has to go hunting today in this, because waiting for the rain to stop is not a plan that the food situation can support, and because the animals the group depends on are out there, somewhere in this rain, doing what animals do, regardless of weather, and the hunters who know how to find them in these conditions are about to find out exactly how much they actually know. So the question worth spending real time on is this. How did ancient humans actually hunt in extended rain? Not the polite version of rain that modern outdoor enthusiasts deal with while wearing Gore-Tex with taped seams and carrying a GPS device. The real thing. Weeks of sustained precipitation, the kind that characterized specific seasons in specific ancient habitats, the kind that changes the ground, changes the air, changes animal behavior, changes the entire sensory and physical landscape that ancient hunters operated in. How did they find animals in conditions that compromised their primary tracking skills? How did they maintain functional weapons when water affects adhesives, degrades fletching, and turns wooden components into liabilities? How did they manage the physiological reality of working in wet cold for extended periods with the technology available to them? The answers are layered, specific, and considerably more sophisticated than the popular image of ancient hunting allows. Start with what rain actually does to the hunting environment, because understanding the challenge requires understanding what changes when extended precipitation hits a landscape that ancient hunters were trying to read. The surface tracking that formed the foundation of ancient hunting practice, reading footprints, disturbed vegetation, soil compression patterns, the direction of bent grass, is directly compromised by sustained rain in ways that range from inconvenient to severe. Fresh rain fills and distorts footprints, softening their edges and reducing the resolution of the information they contain. Heavy rain washes out trails that might have been followed for significant distances in dry conditions. The soil itself changes character, compacting in some areas and becoming adhesive in others, altering the way different animals' tracks are preserved and making the comparative reading of multiple tracks, which animal passed, how recently, in what condition, significantly more demanding. Ancient hunters operating in extended rain could not rely on visual surface tracking to the same degree that dry condition hunting allowed. This was not a minor adjustment. For hunting cultures whose tracking expertise was the primary means of locating and approaching prey, losing the clarity of that visual information stream required accessing different information channels. Channels that rain conditions did not compromise, or that rain conditions actually enhanced. Scent was one of those channels, and rain has a complex relationship with scent that ancient hunters understood in ways that modern people who have never depended on scent-based environmental reading have largely lost access to. Rain suppresses some scents by washing aromatic compounds from surfaces, but it activates and amplifies others. Wet soil releases more volatile organic compounds than dry soil, which is why rain-soaked ground smells the way it does. The distinctive petrichor that humans find pleasant is actually a release of geosmin and other compounds that the wet soil is producing. Wet vegetation releases more aromatic compounds than dry vegetation, and crucially, animal scent. The combination of body odor, glandular secretions, urine, and fecal markings that animals use for territory marking and that ancient hunters used for animal detection behaves differently in wet conditions in ways that experienced ancient hunters learned to read. Moisture increases the persistence of scent at ground level by slowing the evaporation that lifts volatile compounds off surfaces and disperses them upward. This means that in wet conditions, scent trails on the ground can persist longer than in dry conditions, even as the visual tracks they correspond to are being degraded by rain. An ancient hunter following a wet weather trail was sometimes working with a scent track that was more reliable than the visual track, sniffing the ground, reading the aromatic information in crushed vegetation, using their own olfactory capability in ways that dry conditions, with their greater visual information availability, made less necessary. Sound also changed as a hunting tool in rain conditions, and in both directions simultaneously. Extended rain created continuous ambient noise, the pattering of drops on leaves, the sound of running water, the general acoustic environment of wet woodland or grassland that masked some of the sounds ancient hunters used to detect and track prey. An animal moving through dry leaves at 30 meters was audible. The same animal moving through wet leaves in rain was considerably quieter relative to the ambient sound environment, and the hunter's auditory detection range effectively contracted. But rain also created conditions in which large animals produced sounds they did not produce in dry conditions. Wet ground under hooved or padded feet made sounds that dry ground did not. The specific squelch and compression sound of weight pressing into saturated soil, different from the dry ground footfall, and potentially detectable at closer ranges when the hunter knew what to listen for. Rivers and streams running high from rainfall concentration provided different audio landmarks for navigation and animal location. Ancient hunters in extended rain conditions were not simply operating with degraded sound information, they were operating with different sound information that required different interpretive skills. The adaptation of hunting techniques to wet conditions represents one of the most interesting dimensions of ancient hunting sophistication, because it required not just applying established techniques in difficult conditions, but modifying approach based on how specific aspects of both animal behavior and the hunter's own capability changed in sustained rainfall. Animal behavior changes significantly in extended rain, and ancient hunters who understood those changes could use them. Large prey animals in sustained rain tend to seek shelter, moving toward dense vegetation, overhangs, ridgelines that provide partial cover, and the edges of woodland that offer protection from direct precipitation while maintaining access to forage. This concentrates animals in specific landscape features that ancient hunters could target, replacing the wide-range patrol tracking of dry conditions with more focused movement toward known shelter locations. The specific terrain features that functioned as animal shelters in rain conditions were knowledge that accumulated across generations of hunting in specific landscapes. An ancient hunting group operating in a familiar territory knew which hillsides provided shelter from prevailing rain direction, which dense scrub patches large herbivores retreated to during extended precipitation, which water sources became impractical for large animals in flooding conditions and which remained accessible. This landscape-level knowledge, encoded in the accumulated experience of generations of hunters and transmitted through oral tradition and direct mentorship, was the foundation that made wet condition hunting viable when individual sensory tracking became less reliable. Animal behavioral changes in rain extended beyond shelter seeking to altered feeding patterns, movement timing, and social grouping. Grazing animals, unable to feed efficiently in driving rain, often bunched together in ways that reduced individual animal awareness of their surrounding. The group vigilance that herbivore herds maintain as a predator detection system is less effective when every member of the group has their head down and their sensory systems partially compromised by rain noise and reduced visibility. Ancient hunters understood this. Approaching a rain-huddled herd required different technique than approaching an alert, spread-out grazing group in clear conditions, but the altered behavioral state of the prey offered compensatory advantages that experienced hunters exploited. The approach technique in rain deserves specific attention because it was one of the most directly affected elements of the hunting process. Dry condition approach to prey required careful management of the hunter's own scent, staying downwind, moving to avoid placing the hunter's scent stream across the prey's sensitive olfactory detection range. Rain complicated this management in both directions. Wind direction became less reliable and more variable in rain conditions, making scent stream management harder to maintain consistently. But rain also washed human scent compounds more rapidly from the environment, potentially reducing the persistence of the hunter's own scent trail in ways that made accidental detection through old scent traces less likely. The sound dampening effect of rain on ground surfaces was a direct advantage for approach technique. Dry leaves, dry twigs, and dry grass create the kind of noise that alerts prey animals. Wet versions of all of these were substantially quieter underfoot, allowing closer approach before detection in cases where the hunter's movement sounds were the limiting factor on approach distance. Ancient hunters in rain conditions could sometimes close to effective killing range from angles that would have been acoustically impractical in dry conditions, trading the visual tracking clarity they had lost for a movement silence they had gained. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Weapon technology and its management in wet conditions was one of the most significant technical challenges ancient hunters faced in extended rain, and the solutions they developed reflect a level of material knowledge that is easy to underestimate. The composite weapons of ancient hunters, hafted spear points, atlatl darts, and in later periods arrows, depended on adhesive hafting systems and on the mechanical properties of shaft materials that were not indifferent to prolonged water exposure. Plant resin and animal fat adhesives used to secure stone points to wooden shafts softened and lost holding strength when wet. Sinew lashing, while remarkably strong when dry, lost some tension when saturated and required retensioning as it dried. Wooden shafts absorbed moisture and changed their flex characteristics, affecting the projectile dynamics of throwing weapons in ways that required compensatory adjustment of throwing technique. Ancient hunters managing weapons in extended rain developed protocols for protecting and maintaining their tools that went beyond simple waterproofing. The fats used in tool maintenance, animal fat worked into wood to retard moisture absorption, tallow or similar materials applied to maintain adhesive surfaces, were part of a routine maintenance practice rather than a wet weather exception. Tools stored in hide wrapping were kept drier than tools exposed directly to rain. The specific fire management required to dry and retension sinew lashing in wet camp conditions was knowledge that the group's experienced members held and applied when the situation required. The stone points themselves were not compromised by water in the way that organic components were. Flint and similar lithic materials are not meaningfully affected by water exposure, but their edges, once chipped and sharpened, required the same care in wet conditions as in dry, and the resharpening of points in camp during rain periods was one of the productive activities that rain-forced camp time enabled. Ancient hunters who could not go out in the worst conditions were not idle during those periods. Weapon maintenance, tool production, and the preparation of replacement components for damaged or lost tools happened in the camp during the rain in ways that meant the group emerged from an extended wet period with a maintained or improved weapons inventory. The physiological management of hunting in wet, cold conditions required solutions that went beyond simply enduring discomfort. Hypothermia, the dangerous drop in core body temperature that wet, cold conditions accelerate relative to dry cold of the same temperature, was a risk for ancient hunters working in extended rain for hours at a time with the clothing technology available to them. The specific danger of wet cold is that water conducts heat away from the body far more efficiently than air at the same temperature, meaning that soaked clothing provides dramatically less thermal protection than its insulative value in dry conditions would suggest. Ancient hunters managing this risk did so through a combination of clothing strategy, movement strategy, and the management of rest and warming periods. Animal fat rubbed directly onto exposed skin provided some waterproofing and some thermal protection at the skin surface, a technique documented across multiple cultures in cold and wet climates that has ancient roots. Tightly woven or densely felted materials where available shed water more effectively than loosely constructed hides. The layering principle, an inner layer maintaining warmth against the skin while an outer layer took the wet, was a clothing strategy that functions by the same physical principle regardless of the specific materials available. Movement itself was a thermal management strategy. Ancient hunters in wet, cold conditions moved at paces that maintained metabolic heat generation without producing sweat that would further compromise their clothing's thermal performance. A metabolic balance that experienced hunters developed an intuitive feel for through years of operating in exactly these conditions. The specific pace, the specific level of exertion that maintained warmth without crossing into heat-generating effort that would later become a liability. This was embodied knowledge rather than calculated knowledge, felt felt in the body rather than reasoned through, and it was one of the practical skills that differentiated experienced hunters from inexperienced ones in wet weather conditions. Tracking across landscape features changed significantly in extended rain, in ways that required different navigational knowledge than dry condition hunting. Familiar trails flooded or became impassable. Usual crossing points on rivers and streams became dangerous or unusable as water levels rose. The topology of the landscape that hunters carried in their spatial memory was not invalidated by rain, but required a wet condition overlay, knowing which ground retained structure and which turned to mud, which crossings remained viable at what water levels, which high ground routes avoided the flooding of lower terrain while still connecting the hunter to the likely animal locations. This wet condition landscape knowledge was specifically accumulated and specifically transmitted. Elders who had hunted through many seasonal rain periods in a specific territory held knowledge about how that territory behaved in extended precipitation that was not inferable from dry condition experience alone. The young hunters learning their craft in wet conditions were not simply applying their dry condition knowledge in difficult circumstances, they were adding a distinct experiential layer that only wet condition hunting could provide. And they were doing so under the guidance of people who had already built that layer across many previous wet seasons. The social dynamics of hunting in extended rain conditions reveal another dimension of ancient group sophistication. Wet weather hunting typically required smaller parties than optimal dry condition hunting because the noise and movement of a larger group in wet conditions offset the advantages that group coordination provided. 2 or 3 hunters working in close coordination in rain could achieve approach distances that a group of 10 hunters would compromise through accumulated movement, sound, and scent distribution. The smaller wet weather hunting party required different trust and coordination between members. Each person's performance had more direct effect on the group's outcome when the party was smaller, and the specific partnerships that worked well in wet conditions were often different from the partnerships that worked well in dry conditions. Water-based hunting methods became more prominent and more important during extended rain periods when terrestrial hunting was compromised. Rivers and streams running high from rainfall concentrated fish in ways that created harvest opportunities that dry periods did not offer. Fish moving through shallow flooded areas, concentrated at natural barriers where running water created bottlenecks, accessible by wading or from banks in ways that low water conditions did not permit. Waterfowl gathering on flooded areas presented hunting opportunities that had no dry weather equivalent in many landscapes. Ancient hunters who maintained diverse technical repertoires could shift emphasis toward water-based harvesting during extended rain periods in ways that partially offset the reduced efficiency of terrestrial hunting. The camp life dimension of extended rain hunting periods deserves acknowledgement because it shaped the entire context in which hunting decisions were made and hunting parties departed. Extended rain in an ancient camp was a sustained test of the group's social cohesion and resource management under conditions of reduced caloric acquisition and increased physical discomfort. The management of wet firewood, the techniques for processing damp fuel to extract enough combustion to maintain a fire, the specific positions and fuel arrangements that maximized heat output from compromised materials, was camp-critical knowledge that the firekeepers held and applied continuously during wet periods. The morale dimension of extended rain periods was real and was managed through the same social and cultural mechanisms that ancient groups used to manage collective psychological states under other forms of sustained challenge. Stories, humor, the maintenance of normal social routines where possible, the keeping of practices that signaled normalcy and continuity in conditions that threatened to feel like deterioration. Ancient hunters who set out into extended rain from a camp that was managing its morale and its social cohesion effectively were hunters with a better internal state for the task than hunters who left a camp in which the extended rain had begun to erode the group's psychological stability, the knowledge of when to hunt and when to wait, the specific assessment of rain conditions that told experienced ancient hunters whether a given period represented manageable wet hunting conditions or conditions severe enough that the caloric cost of the attempt would exceed the likely caloric return, was one of the most practically significant judgments in wet weather hunting. Getting that judgment wrong in either direction had costs. Hunting in conditions that were too severe produced exhausted, hypothermia risk hunters who returned empty-handed, while wading through conditions that were actually manageable produced unnecessary food stress. The judgment was not made by algorithm. It was made by people who had accumulated enough experience in specific landscapes and specific rain conditions to have an earned intuitive sense of where the line was. Ancient hunters standing at the edge of camp in the rain, looking at the sky and the ground and the particular quality of the day, making the assessment of whether today was a hunting day or a waiting day, were not guessing. They were reading information that years of experience in that specific landscape had taught them to read. In a context where the accumulated knowledge of the group's most experienced members provided a framework that younger hunters were in the process of internalizing. The rain was the same rain that has always fallen. The hunters reading it were people with the same cognitive capability you are running right now, applied to a problem that their survival depended on solving reliably enough to eat through the wet season and come out the other side with a group that was still functional and still fed. They were very good at it. The proof is that you are here.